stage number 4, revision. It's interesting because this is probably where most of your time is currently spent. Most of you are probably so fixated on studying the material after your classes have ended and you're cramming a week or 2 weeks before your exam. And you find that you're not doing that well on your exams. You're finding that you're wasting a lot of that time, right? Because we all know that the efficiency of your studying declines if you are studying for such extensive periods of time. So that's a very inefficient way of doing this. And this is actually where you save a bulk of your time. So stage 4 consists of 2 parts. The first part is creating diagram number 3. This is your optimized version. It's your ability to reorganize and then simplify what you've already created in your diagrams 1 and 2. We saw how the one in class got a little bit messy. You probably added some more information since then. But here, you want to make it so that it becomes an invaluable resource for you. How do you do that? Is start to make use of different subgroups. So for personal, I've created the subgroups of physical, of perception, of preference. And in them, I have all these different types of detail, right? So I have body type, skin tone, silhouette. And then in perception, I have confidence and mood. And in preference, I have styles. And so now it's organized in a way in which, for me, it's easier to understand and more relevant to me. I've made use of illustration. So as my brother is going through the different patterns, he's really gone over 4 essential ones, which were monochromatic, which were plaid, which were striped, and which were polka dots. And because I'm organizing this in a way in which I can actually pick out a good outfit for myself, I thought it made sense for me to draw them out in the order in which I prefer, right? I heavily prefer monochromatic, as you can see in my shirt right now. And then plaid, and then stripe, and then polka dots are really not something that I like. And then I go ahead and I start to bold certain relationships. I start to realize, okay, my personal choice is actually very, very important as it leads to the colors selection. And I've reorganized some of these groups. I've created multiple relationships with 2 groups, right? So I've created a relationship from occasion to season and then season to occasion. I've created illustrations here. And so when you look at this, for me, I can immediately understand the knowledge it's trying to portray in an instant. That's what you're aiming to do with diagram number 3. You're trying to make this a resource for yourself, and it will become really beneficial as we go into part number 2 of this final stage. And that is your active recall applications. And the 3 that we're going to go in this order are 1, the blurting method, 2, the Feynman technique, and 3, practice test. We've just talked about how important active recall is, but first you're going to start with blurting. And there's a lot of videos on YouTube that will teach you how to do this. But in terms of a general understanding, I can give that to you right now. First, you identify what your source material is going to be. So that could be your textbook, or this could be a recorded lecture. You're going to pick a part of that source that you want to learn at the time. And then after reading the textbook or watching the lecture, you're going to put that source away. You're not going to look at it. You're going to completely remove it. You're going to then grab a blank sheet of paper and write out everything that you can freely recall from your source. You'll find that this is really hard. Trying to forcefully retrieve information out of your brain is going to require deliberate effort, but it's actually that effort that leads to meaningful learning. So be patient as you go throughout this process. Practically, you'll remember certain pieces of information, and inevitably there will be gaps. But the amazing part here is that because you've gone through the process of creating these diagrams, you have such a good understanding of how the major concepts relate to one another that when you go to fill in the gaps, a lot of those things will naturally start to make sense. And so as you go throughout this process, you'll find that you'll actually recall a lot more than if you hadn't created any of the diagrams. If you hadn't gone through the previous stages, you might have remembered maybe 10-15% your first attempt, but actually you'll find that you have a really good baseline here. You might, after attempt number 1, recall 60%. After you go through that process, you'll open up your source again and make corrections, right? You might have forgotten some things, you might have made certain incorrect statements. You'll fix them, and then after you've done that and gone through the process of correcting it, you'll crumple off attempt number 1, that piece of paper, and throw it out because you're not going to use it anymore. Go take a break, go do something else, and then return for attempt number 2. You'll find that attempt number 2, you'll do a lot better. You'll probably be around 70-75% perhaps. And then by the time you get into your third attempt, perhaps you've recalled everything that you need to recall. Maybe you're close to 90-95%. Once you get to that point, you're good. I think the blurting method is a really good starting place for your active recall. It forces you to try and recall freely as much that you can possibly remember. And in doing so, you'll have a really good indication of, again, what things you're able to readily often remember, and then some things that you still need a little bit of work on. After you go through that process, you'll move into the 5-minute technique as your second active recall application. And this requires you to teach the topic as if the person receiving the information was someone at the level of a 5th grader. You're probably going to have to reorganize the groups and the major concepts in a way that will make more sense to someone that is hearing this for the first time. And you'll find that you will naturally, if you do this verbally aloud, you will hesitate on areas that you're weak on, right? Or perhaps you can record yourself or have somebody listen to you as you do this, and they'll give you the feedback and they'll tell you, actually, I didn't understand this part. And perhaps you had an assumption that it was an obvious, more intuitive element that didn't need any more explanation, but somebody gave you the feedback, or you listened to your recording and thought, actually, I could have done a better job of explaining that. That's another area of weakness. And so again, the baseline of you starting this, because you've gone through the previous stages, will be very high. In just a few iterations of this, you should be really in a good place to then start the third application, which are practice tests. And I think that practice tests are probably the best resource that you can use to narrow down what you need to study for your exam, right? Because if you can utilize exams from past years, you have a lot of clues in terms of content emphasis, in terms of perhaps trick questions or things to look out for. But the problem is, so if you're not able to understand why an answer is correct or why the other answers are incorrect, then by the time that question is reframed on your exam, you're not gonna know how to solve them, right? So as you approach a question, you should really take the time to freely recall, put your sources away, don't look things up right now. You've done a lot of the learning already, so here you're trying to review and trying to pull the information out of your brain and give as exhaustive an answer as possible. You're going to circle the ones that you think are right or write out the short-ended answers. But at the same time, focus on, okay, these answers are wrong because X, Y, and Z, right? You're also going to provide those explanations thoroughly. And if you really, really do get stuck, then you can go into your diagram, right? You can look at your diagram and see if that can help you answer the question, because that's a cue that you've created. That's how you've learned the material. And then at the very end, if you really have no idea how to solve this problem, then you can go ahead and look at your sources to find a way to exhaustively answer it. And then you'll remember that answer, you'll notate it somewhere so that you'll have it for reference in the future, because obviously that was a really big area of weakness for you. So those 3 applications of utilizing active recall have now made you prepare. And again, these are just a few iterations for each of these 3 applications, right? Perhaps you do 2 blurting rounds, you do 2 Feynman technique rounds, and then you go through 1 previous year's exam. But because you've already learned the information properly the first time around, because you've been able to deeply process the information the first time around through all the linkages that you've created, this is where you save a lot of your time. I promise you that.